Video in the things.
Okay. Well, while we're doing that, I can do an introduction.
Yeah, go ahead.
We want to save time here. Not still too late. Well, thank you for the introduction. I appreciate this conference very much. This is the sixth time I've been here in 10 years. And I really appreciate it because for lay people like me, this is a great place to learn things. Today I learned about context.
Yes.
So that's what I'm going to do.
If you didn't get a newsletter, would you raise your hand? Okay. Thank you. No. Go ahead.
Yes, okay. Well, with that brief introduction, I want to give you just a little bit of background as to who I am and what I do. As Tommy already mentioned, I'm involved in the financial area. I'm not going to give you a full CV, but earlier on, back in the 80s, I was a research director for a Wall Street firm. I had many analysts working for me. And at that point in time, I got quite involved on the global side. So since that point in time, for about 25 years or so, most of my involvement, if not all of my involvement, was researching and watching world affairs, particularly in the economic area. Later on, I became head of Canada's largest financial institutions global operations, which I had the opportunity to build. And again, it was a great time for myself, almost spending half of the year overseas traveling during those days to really learn a lot about the world. And one of the things that happened, myself being a Christian, Bible-reading Christian, and having been influenced by many dispensationalists, I think probably some authors in this room, Dave Hunt and so forth, it really struck me that the things that I was observing traveling around the world in this particular area did align with Bible prophecy. So we became very interested about that in those times, and I felt very compelled to write about it and help Christians understand what's happening and why it's a great threat also to Christianity. And that's when we founded that newsletter 17 years ago. I remember asking the chairman of my board at the time if the bank, this being the largest bank in Canada, had any difficulty with me writing a private investment letter. And for some reason, God had it such that he only asked me one question. He said, "We'll compete with the bank." I said, "Surely not." Oops. Okay. So anyway, that's when we started that, and I've been writing that openly all the time, even though I've been working in a secular profession, and that creates some interesting situations. So with that for my introduction, I'll launch into my presentation. You're going to be looking at that title and wondering, what's that got to do with current affairs? It really does, but since this is the first time I'm speaking to this audience, I do want to set a little bit of a context. It's very important. The other thing I'm going to do is take more of a global perspective. So I'm not going to be dealing, per se, always with North American things. Where the big action is happening is from a global perspective, so I want to talk about that. Well, four things I'm going to do here quickly. I want to give you a sense of where we are on the cosmological timeline. It's very important to get a grip on that. End-time commercialism the Bible talks about. How far evolved is the ensnaring end-time money system? That's a question on the lips of many Christians. And how would the trends that we see today fit into that? And then finally, I do want to dedicate just a couple of minutes as to the application it has for us Christians. What things do we have to watch out for? What approaches should we take? So with that, where are the prophetic connections that align with this financial topics that I'm going to be talking about right now? I see over 40 signs mentioned in the Bible that are of relevance in the financial economic area. I don't have time to talk about those, but here are just some. Deep commercialism, Zechariah 1 through chapter 5, certainly Revelation 18, and many other places give us an indication that that would happen in the last days, end times. Economic oppression and wealth distribution disparities worldwide. I'll show you how badly that's already gone so far. James talks about that in chapter 5. Deep indebtedness of governments. I think it is talked about in the Bible, in Habakkuk 2:7. Globalism and globalization, we've already heard plenty about that today, so I'm not going to spend any time on that, but certainly many, many verses verifying that, and it has an impact on financial markets and the things that we're seeing day to day. Finally, pervasive corruption, deceit, and a dependence on lying and stealing. That's very much a part of the financial industries today. It's dependent upon those things, and it has been prophesied. Now, I'd like you to look at this graph very, very carefully. And it gives you a sense where we are. So that's a chart that shows GDP, gross domestic product, or in this case, GNI, per person for the entire world since Christ left this earth. And what do you notice? All of a sudden, why not earlier? Why was it then? But late 1800s, all of a sudden, this exploded. So you can see where we are right now. We're on the top of that. So you can see how far in the space of the human timeline in 100 years, how far this has progressed. Let's look a little closer. Now I'm going to show you that same line from before, but basically over the last 30 years, 35 years, basically my career on Wall Street and on Bay Street, as they call it, Canada. And now I'm just showing you all the financial instruments that are out there being quoted in one form or another. And now it jumps much, much further. In fact, just to give you a scale, that represents 13 times the gross national product of the entire world. This is a massive explosion, and it's all happened, this that I'm showing you here, in the last number of decades. And it's inconceivable, really, how many relationships, financial obligations, and so forth are layered into this big pile of money. And that's the world that we live in today. And it's all come about very, very rapidly. Most of us don't realize it, either because we don't focus on it, but also because we've been inculcated into that society and we think it's quite normal. Now, I'm going to just focus on a couple of quick trends here, bring you up to date on some of them, just some of them, which I think are very, very important. The Bible does talk about a wealth skew, of course, the rich oppressing the poor at some point in time. And we have that condition today already. It's quite substantial. Just recently, Oxfam came out with a publication and a quote, and their research showed recently that the 85 wealthiest people of the world now have more than the poorest half of the world's population. So this gives you context how far things have already gone. I'll give you another graph about that. I want to give you a sense of the milieu that we're in, this financial, commercialized world that we're in. Central banking, we all talk about that as if it existed forever. The Federal Reserve, I'm sure everyone have heard about. But central banking is a really recent phenomenon. It hasn't been around that long. There were only 14 central banks in 1900, all of those virtually being European. But what happened since in 100 years? Virtually every country in the world, communist or not, has a central bank. It's very important as a step to setting up the financial conditions worldwide that allow Revelations 13:17 to be fulfilled. I'll talk about that in just a bit. Corporations. We all know corporations is America is the home to the headquarters of the majority, not the majority of them, but the largest per capita. But something very interesting again. Did you know that the corporate entity, as we know it today, is also a very recent invention? It's only since the early 1950s that corporations, now we call them multinational corporations or TNCs, have become so influential. And I want to give you a quick picture of how influential. They're the most powerful group in the world. Very interesting study just came out a number of years ago by some researchers in Switzerland. And they tracked the ownership trends of all the major companies in the world. And believe this, 647 global multinationals, only 647, today account for control of 80% of all world companies. Can you really, does that strike you, 647 corporations? That's unbelievable. That's how far things have gone. That's how integrated the world is, not just America, but the entire world. So again, I just want to give you another focus here on these global titans. I've followed these statistics for decades, and I remember getting information from UNCTAD, which is a UN division, which provides information on global corporations and such, international investment. Very hard to get information now. They've shut down some of this information availability. But here's just an estimate. I'm again going back to 1950. 1950, corporate activity, multinationals, particularly is what I'm talking about here, would have accounted for 3% of the value-added GDP in the entire world back then. Today, I'm estimating it's about close to half, 45% to a half of all activity, economic activity, added value, is attributable to multinational corporations. In fact, their total revenues are greater than the annual GDP of the entire world. Now, what are corporations? I want to make this point very, very quickly. Corporations, yes, they're a very, very convenient legal structure, but they're also an obedience structure. They're very, very good at organizing and motivating large groups of people, just like, Francis Loyola was able to found the Jesuits on his obedience principle. The great generals, Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan, pardon me, they couldn't have achieved anything without these obedience structures, and corporations are very effective that way in driving behavior. I don't know who of you have worked for large multinational corporations, but try being disobedient in one of those organizations. You'll see what happens very quickly. I believe they're the most powerful source of power, I should say, or structure in the world today. They have enormous influence. So here we are. We're described very briefly, like I regale you with many more statistics, but we're in this world today that only sees through eyes of a commercial dimension, mostly. Certainly people like me, because I work in that field all my life. But generally speaking, most of us have that same disposition to see the world that way. And why is that? I would maintain, as the Bible tells us, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray, is part of this. And I'll point to a couple of Bible verses a little later that further bear that out. So the question is how and why? Why would our enemy, the Satan and his words, find it so important to work on this unity that we're seeing and integration and centralization in financial markets around the world? Why is that so necessary? Well, I would maintain that really there is no other more effective way of coordinating global activity, human activity and obedience, than through a global financial structure. If you think about it, there's no other more effective way. Satan is not omnipresent. He doesn't have the benefit that God does, or the Holy Spirit. So they have had to scheme up other ways of controlling the world. They've done it very, very effectively, and that's why the financial industry is the focus of it. It's a necessary strategy for Satan and his fallen angels. One last thing here, just to finish up giving you the context here of what we're talking about, is the impact on our individual lives. 100 years ago, the average household, so I'm showing to you there on the left, pardon me, only about 20% of human activity at that time involved the financial transaction of some type. Mom would cook at home, do the laundry at home, that sort of thing. Nowadays, money's share of our activities, if you will, has gone much, much higher. It's tripled, at least. It's hard to make these estimates. But today, virtually everything we do involves a transaction of some type. We go out and buy a pizza. Mom doesn't cook it anymore. I'll give you many more examples like that. But you can see how we're being captured, how our activities and incentives are being captured. What's the impact of this end-time money system that we're talking about? Facilitates a world under the dominion of elites, 10 kings, and mammon, centralization aspect of it, and there's a number of Bible references, I believe, that support that. If it facilitates the global rule of the Antichrist and the false prophet, we know what happens in Revelation 13:17, where a system is put in place, enforced by the false prophet, that no one could buy or sell. I want to talk about that in just a moment. It ensnares people. You're part of this now. You can't get out. We're all trapped already physically as part of this financial system. You cannot live outside that financial system today. It's no longer possible. Spiritually, yes, but not physically. It's already gone that far. So in that sense, we're very vulnerable, and Christians are especially, that we fall prey to that particular trap. We'll give it some more dimensions in just a second. And it also importantly aligns with the last day conditions prophesied for the nations. I think there's some different applications for the church age as opposed to most of these things playing out in the tribulation period. So I call it the Babylon occlusion. That being us Westerners having a very difficult time seeing how this whole veil has dropped over us. We're almost virtually complete in this commercialization of mankind's perspective and values, I believe. Even such statistics as I used briefly, I mentioned gross domestic product. That's another invention. Nobody ever thought before 75, 80 years ago that this idea of the moneyness of human activity, human society, should be tabulated in a figure like GDP. very new. They only started in the 1930s. Today, virtually every country does that. And it's a very important substructure that builds of this whole edifice of wealth that dances before our eyes if we watch the financial statistics day to day. And a big driver of humanism. And I would maintain even that what we're really witnessing is a form of ecumenicism, call it a financial form of ecumenicism, in that what's happening is that the devil is perpetuating this sweet little lie that we can both serve Mammon and God together. If you have read, of course we all have, 1 Timothy 3 verses 1 through 3, or 2 verses 1 through 3. 1 through 5, pardon me. And where it talks about what those last day Christians are going to be like. They're going to love money and so on and so forth. Yet they see themselves as godly, as representing godliness. So they've bridged this gap here between serving Mammon and serving God. And it's such a beautiful, sweet little lie. Wow, you can serve Mammon too and have the benefits of Mammon and put all your efforts into getting the benefits of Mammon. At the same time, you can still be a godly Christian. Not necessarily so. For generations, this Bible prophecy was not considered possible. Not until recently. And again, I'm getting back to Revelation 13:17. That's the penultimate verse in the Bible. I would say that definitively is a prophecy about finance and money. How could that have happened? And when you think about it, I won't have much time to go into the sub-conclusions of what happens following Revelation 13:17. It really does mean that nobody can transact at that time whatsoever. You can't buy a house. You won't be able. Gold won't help you. You have to be part of that financial transactional system, whatever form it's going to take in those days. It doesn't matter where you are, in the wilderness or in a great metropolis. So how does that happen? Well, I'm going to just give you a quick play-by-play as to how it happens and how far along we are. I say basically 4 things need to happen. I'm being very general here. And we'll tie it into the current events here in just a sec. First, you have to have a globally integrated and closed financial system. That's very, very important. And we have that today. And you know why it is important? Some of the policies that we're seeing recommended by central bankers around the world lately. For example, I'll get into it in just a minute, a little more detail. But we need to have a closed financial system in order to perpetrate or to put into place negative interest rates. Actually, it's true. There's a number of banks already in Europe because of the dire economic situations. They've had to reduce interest rates so much. For the privilege of having your deposit at that bank, you will pay the money now. You get no interest. You pay them negative interest. That's where you are already. But to have that ability, you must have a closed financial system. At least ability for policymakers. And then you must have a system of central banking everywhere. I showed you that chart a little earlier, which showed you the rapid proliferation of the central bank ideologies, that now being over 180 central banks around the world. You have to have a common understanding, a philosophy, behavioral expectations to monetary policies. We have that today as well. And then we need at some point legal powers of individual country central banks to be ceded to a worldwide authority. Right now, all central banks, and that's true even in Europe, where unification is underway, still have some authority over their own affairs. And right now, that does not exist. And we're going to need some more crises in future, more global financial crises such as we've seen roll here just 6 years ago. In fact, I still think is underway. It is not over. So we need some more of those crises probably to get these things ran through. And the final thing, of course, we need what I call a global unified political economy that then chooses to put that system in place. And of course, we know, as the Bible tells us, that's going to be the false prophet, not the Antichrist, the false prophet. So the first 2 are there. The other conditions that I mentioned are fast being developed, and we can't predict exactly when those things happen, but we're well on the way. I would say the hardest parts have already been completed. So let's turn to financial markets, current financial markets, and I want to tell you about some current trends, which are quite interesting. And as I jump into that and tell you what the policymakers are trying to do these days, I want to give you some reasons why the world is facing some of the troubles it is right now and why policymakers, economists, macroeconomists are having such a hard time coming up with solutions, at least solutions that work. None of them have worked so far. I'll just lay out a couple of these. There's many of them, but here I'm going to say these are the most important ones. Firstly, the wealth distribution, as already alluded to earlier, in the world has become highly skewed. Smaller and smaller core of people own more and more of the wealth. And that's a huge detraction for economic health. It actually causes economies to slow in growth. So that's a condition that's underway, and you can't have that condition. In fact, we must not talk about debt levels overall without also talking about the distribution issue I just did. It's the flip side of the coin. And so the flip side obviously is total debt levels, and that continues to go up worldwide. Here I'm just showing you one. America isn't the only one that has the problem. From my perch where I look at things globally, I then obviously look at things also comparatively. And I can tell you that the U.S.'s problems aren't as bad as some other countries. They're all bad. When I look at currency markets and try to discern what's happening there isn't a good currency left in the world. They're all fiat currencies. It's just basically an ugly contest, and you're trying to pick the least ugly one. Lately, the U.S. dollar has been the least ugly.
What about Switzerland?
They're ugly too, but not as ugly as others. But I will talk about them in just a second. But from an American perspective, the rest of the world, believe it or not, sees the American dollar still as a safe haven. And it's gone up quite a lot here recently, at least right now. Things are so tumultuous, they're going to change anyway. And I do think the conditions will change here in the next couple of years for the U.S. as well, and I'm going to talk about that. Here's another big thing that's happening, and that's a big shift in world economic power. We've heard a lot about how quickly China has grown economically, Asia, so on and so forth. And so the economic gravity center, if you will, of the world is again changing. At one time, China was the leading economy of the world. It was so for 18 centuries. And then sort of fell off the map as Britain and America became the more wealthy countries in the world. It's now going back the other way. And that's causing a lot of dislocation. We don't have a G20 anymore today, yes, in name, but they're not in unity about major financial and economic policies at all. And I do think that this dynamic may have something to do with why the U.S. might face some of its troubles as the 10 kings come. It's a completely new, different topic, but this does impact things right now. A third thing here to allude to, already mentioned at this conference, is this whole issue of post-familialism. That's where we are today. People aren't having kids, they're not getting married. And that's has a massive impact on economic growth and also financial markets. It's a huge delusion for people to think that they don't need to have kids. I wouldn't suggest how many kids people should have, but it's a delusion to think that a society does not raise children, second generations, have reasonable population growth, and to think that your pension fund's going to pay up. It's absolutely impossible. That's why we're having the problems already today. Post-familialism, that's God judging those kinds of crazy attitudes that are coming into play today. That's God's natural laws in a sense as well, and that mathematically pension funds cannot exist and function. And we're already seeing that dynamic here today. This past century saw two unprecedented things happening in terms of world population. One was a population explosion over 100 years ago, progressively into the 1960s. And since then, the other remarkable thing is we've had unprecedentedly the first voluntary, in peacetime, reduction in population growth. And those are massive adjustments for financial markets to take. Most significantly here, the latter trend that I'm talking about. So that lies underneath this. Here's already a demonstration of what's happening to the workforces around the world. Increasingly, populations, an increasing proportion of populations are now the elderly. It's a big problem for Japan. Basically, Japan is finished. if it doesn't figure out how to get their population growth up, or immigrants in, they are going to collapse. They're well on their way to doing that. I find it funny, that's part of the times that we live in, where analysts look at everything in terms of economics. They call the big problem the world has today a demand deficiency syndrome. And I look at what the Japan people are suffering from. Basically, every time somebody dies over there or gets older, it's a demand deficiency syndrome. We won't call them mortalities anymore. We'll just call them demand deficiency syndromes. But basically, that's how economists are looking at things these days. Nonetheless, the bottom conclusion to this is that if you have population demographics such as I described, it means lower economic growth. It doesn't matter what you do from a stimulus point of view, policy point of view, you are still not going to get over the fundamental underlying problems that we just talked about here. So that impacts what we're seeing here today. All these things that I discussed so far are due to, not happenstance, they're all due to volitional human decisions. Humanity has decided that these are the conditions that it wants, and that it wants to be an idolatrous world running after fictitious wealth. Well, let's get down to some of the things that are going on here right now with our friendly central bankers around the world. I'm showing you a couple here. Of course, Janet Yellen, who's the head of the U.S. Federal Reserve. Showing you there also Mario Draghi and Haruhito Kuroda, the head of the Bank of Japan. And they're in dire straits these days. They've all... Janet Yellen looks the best, of course, because American economic progress here has looked the best. It hasn't been great, but it's looked the best comparatively to the rest of the world. And what's their agenda? Basically, central banking these days, it used to be much more sophisticated tasks that they had, but these days, the last number of years, they've been most preoccupied with trying to get economic growth back, get unemployment back up. Those are all good things. Of course, nothing bad there. But they're not having any success. It's been very, very difficult. And so they're getting more and more desperate, pulling more rabbits out of the hat, but they're not really real rabbits. They aren't working. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that in the next couple of seconds and minutes. What are they doing? I already mentioned how low interest rates are in some parts of the world. In fact, we're seeing interest rate lows around the world that haven't ever happened before. All-time lows in history. 500-year lows in Sweden. 300-year lows, I think, in Spain. What's going on? And so this is of course deliberate by the central banking authorities around the world, and to an extent they've coordinated it at the beginning, not so much lately, and feeling that the lower they can get these interest rates, the better it's going to be to stimulate economic growth. But of course there's a flip side to that which nobody looks at. And what it means is that your retirement capital has to work a lot harder to get you the income you need when you're going to be retired. If you did that with 10% interest rates, you'd have an easier time than you are now with 0.3% of an interest rate. So it's a form of inflation. Nobody tells you that. But it's a virulent form of inflation when your retirement has gone up that much in price. And that's happening around the world. It's going to be a huge dilemma as it plays out in future decades. Now, the dilemma here for the central banks, as I already mentioned, they're doing all this pumping into financial systems with excessive reserves and so forth, basically printed money. But at the same time, as you see on that chart, the expected world GDP growth continues to slide. What's going on? Shouldn't things be turning around here? Well, we already mentioned some of the underlying causes as to why some of these policies aren't going to be effective. But what this situation does do, it triggers now central bankers to come up with a lot of new unorthodox policies, things that have never been done before. And some of them are very important that I tell you about. Where does all this sort of thinking come from? I just want to take a little bit of a side detour. And I find the Goethe's play, Faust, had a very important insight. And I don't know how familiar you are with that story, but Mephistopheles, who is sort of an image for Satan, goes to the emperor in Goethe's Faust, and he says, such paper in the place of actual gold, so let's get rid of gold, is practical. We know just what we hold. But wise men will, when they have studied it, place infinite trust in what is infinite. So here, this is, 400 years ago that this was written. They understood that they could bring around a financial system that was not really based on anything foundational of value, but it could be something infinite, like infinite paper. So it's an important insight in those days. And that's what we're seeing playing out today. It's a form of delusion. But today we're placing infinite trust in infinite money. Yes, we want to of course we want to put our trust in the infinity of God, most definitely. But here, this is the big ruse that's being pulled over the wire of the eyes of the entire world. So the central bankers now are, as I said, trying to come up with these unorthodox policies, but now they're also fighting each other. We are in a monetary war today, without a question. Without a question. And the Central Bank of Japan has been the most aggressive recently. 5 years ago, if somebody told me that some of these things are going to happen, I'd say I don't believe it. I don't think it's possible that anybody would do such stupidity. I'll talk about the Swiss bank. You know, the Swiss bank, Schweiz national bank, one time was considered the best bank in the world. It's the gold bank. Hard currency even up until about 20 years ago. But you know, today, when everybody's going down the tube and has all these problems, everybody jumps on the strong swimmer. And you know what happens when everybody jumps on the strong swimmer? The swimmer gets pulled down. And so to have a high integrity in financial systems only comes at great, great cost these days. So even the Central Bank of Switzerland is completely caved in. They've got the worst balance sheet of almost all countries now. It's quite amazing. So even the formerly strong central banks have really, really deteriorated and sort of joined the show. We have no strong currencies in the world today. They're all fiat. Well, a little bit of fun here with the Bank of Japan. As I mentioned, they've been the most aggressive. The first wave, I thought that was interesting. The Mitsubishi A6Ms that they used in the Second World War were called Zeros. And the analogy to war is apt here. And then most recently, they did another big bout of what's called quantitative easing. Just give you an idea how big it is. Over the next year, they will be printing money, basically, to give you a short-form version of it, the equivalent of $1.5 trillion in U.S. terms. So imagine your central bank printing $1.5 trillion in 1 year. I mean, this is absolute desperation. And it's going to completely destroy Japan eventually. The problem with Japan's situation is that because we have integrated global financial markets, what they do impacts everything else. Complete distortions we're seeing in investment structures, speculation, and so forth. It's a monetary war. It's anything goes. So we're dealing with these aren't your grandfather's financial markets anymore. You can't look at them that way. They're totally corrupt. And we've got monetary junkie markets. They're all dependent on fictitious money, as we've seen them pump in central banks around the world. Zombie economies and companies in some parts of the world. I call it psychotropic policymaking. It's all about trying to get people to feel better, and whatever way you can do it, that's the way to do it. And as I already mentioned, it's terribly corrupt. Now, much more I won't really jump. Maybe in the question period you could ask me, and I'll save a few minutes here, as I'm only allotted 45 minutes here. But central banks are coming out with more and more policies, desperately trying to get economies going. They love the fact that their policies pump up financial markets. It's a form of asset inflation. But now we're getting really cockamamie ideas. Just one article that came out 2 months ago, written by a university prof and a money manager. This was published in Foreign Policy Review, and which is a sort of a highbrow publication, and it's always often used to sort of fly balloons in terms of new policy ideas and such. And this is what they say. This is the title of their paper. Print less money but transfer more. Why central banks should give money directly to the people. I think everybody would like that, right? If they would just give us money. But seriously, this was written in seriousness. That since central banks have the facility to be able to fictitiously create money, why not give it to everybody? So if you're going to give it to people who'll spend it. So to do that, give it to governments. Any money you give to governments, lend to them, they'll spend it. And then, of course, if you send money to certain households of socioeconomic group, they're going to spend it too. So we'll get economies going that way. I could go on with some of these, to give an idea of some of these inane ideas. I wrote an article on this particular one refuting it, and it's unbelievable that it's considered to be even, respectable economic policy, macroeconomic policy. And there's other ideas. Larry Summers is well known, of course, is promoting the idea that the best way forward is also print money. But give it all to governments on infrastructure projects. Well, yeah, I think we all would like better infrastructure, but if you're going to be pumping it up on debt like that in an unlimited fashion, we're also deluding ourselves. And then there's this very latest idea, which is getting a lot of support, and I really would like to talk to you about that some more, and I can even explain how it works, is what's called money finance, or overt permanent money finance. There's a lot of thinkers around there that are pushing that forward, and I think it's very important to understand because I really see that sort of playing in with this timeline, prophetic timeline, as it then plays out in the tribulation period. So if we get something like OPMF, you could easily explain that situation where we have that inflation depicted with the daily wages, touching out the wine. I forgot the exact reference for that one. So asking me about OPMF, I'm going to skip over the next couple of slides. But if you're interested, we can do that in the question period, and I explain to you what they're actually proposing. And so I'll jump ahead. Now, I said that there's a lot of people around the world that are supporting these kinds of policies. There's research groups. George Soros set up a group a number of years ago called INET, Institute for New Economic Thinking. You got guys like Lord Adair Turner, who used to be the former head of a large financial government institution in Britain. He's coming up with some of these ideas. I mean, there's many of them, but he's considered brilliant. And I think you and I would look through those recommendations that they come up with as absolute malarkey, things that wouldn't work, wouldn't be sustainable over the long term. But yet, it has high endorsement all around the world. The economics that we have today is immoral. I rarely see the word moral or morality ever in an economics document. I read hundreds of documents a week. Plugged in all over the place, and it's amazing to me that how some of these macroeconomics that are recommending policy to governments can do it without any bad conscience. I'll give you just some ideas. Today, why do countries need their own currencies? Well, the reason they want it is because they want to have the flexibility to depreciate the currency so they can shove their economic misalignments on the rest of the world. Doing that through currency debasement. That's considered brilliant. But in terms of morality, I would say no. And that's where you sort of see the things that come out of Zechariah chapter 5 about stealing and lying and that kind of thing, characterizing the environment that we're in the last days. That's definitely an extension or an example of that sort of condition. Number two, how do you rescue a country's economy without raising debt levels further? Well, you print money. And hopefully I'll get an opportunity to show you how that happens. But the result, however, is terrible because it's a form of theft. There is no such thing as money for nothing. Absolutely not. And it has huge repercussions, one of which we've already talked about, and that is this huge skewing of the wealth distribution in the world. Let's not make right for past wrongs. There is no such concept of sin, really, in economics. It's very unpopular. Nobody wants to put in austere economic policies to rectify some of the problems of the past. So they're coming up with other means of doing it, and such as some macroeconomics are recommending that we just default. That's an acceptable, moral solution to the problems that we're in. I could go on and on. As I say, the policy prescriptions that are coming out these days are highly immoral. I can't use that word immoral when I'm writing in a secular environment. I have to use different words, otherwise I offend people and get a lot of feedback. But anyhow, The Bible is very definitive about central banking today, I believe. And it indicts it as evil. And I'll just read this one section here out of Micah 6:8-15. You'll find that it really does parallel the environment today. I know we're not Israel, but it's very similar today as was then in Israel. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly. Am I still to forget your ill-gotten treasures, you wicked house, and the short ephah, economic measure, which is accursed? Shall I acquit someone with dishonest scales, with a bag of false weights? Your rich people are violent, your inhabitants are liars, and their tongues speak deceitfully. You will eat but not be satisfied, your stomach will still be empty, you will store up but save nothing. That's where we're today. That's how extreme it really is today. It doesn't matter what financial policy you're going to put in place from a policymaker's perspective, your stomachs will still be empty. That's how God decreed these things would go. I find so many verses in the Bible which talk about dishonest scales. So this is something God did not leave us in any confusion about. Very, very definitely don't play around with scales. Have honest scales. On and on. There's many of them. And just to save time here, I just wanted to show you how many there are. And there's more. It's a big, big no-no. Do not play around with the scales. And which I find interesting, if you look at it in a picture form, the old style scales, right? Where they had two sides to them. And I remember doing that in science class 35 years ago. I don't know if you've ever used those kinds of scales. And you had to use a fixed weight, such as you see there on the right. And it all depended on those weights being correct, that they weren't tampered with. And then you could accurately and honestly weigh some. And that's why the Bible talks about these weights that God has determined. He sets the boundaries. He sets the benchmarks. And this is what's not being observed in financial or central banking around the world today. Well, I want to come to conclusions. I'll quote an interesting book that came out just a year ago talking about debt dynamics over the first 5,000 years by David Graeber. He says, we are now witnessing the rise of the first planetary administrative system designed to protect the interests of the creditors over the social contract. He's somewhat irreverent. He says the banksters and the bean counters rule the world. I agree with that. We're definitely there. And the thing to realize, we think we're such advanced societies these days, particularly as the world is globalized and that we have everything under control. The truth of the matter is the system that we're living in today, it being a credit-based system, is the most base social system that history has ever presented. It never was like that thousands of years ago. But that's our society today. Who are the most important men in the world today? Most important people in the world today? Just as Revelation 18 says, the merchants of the world were the big important people. That's how upside down things get, and we're there already, so not much needs to happen. I want to put a little context. I appreciated Carl Techrib's pointing out the same thing. And that is that, we're talking about very, very senior elite people here, policymakers and so forth. They're human beings. We're not saying there's a big, grand conspiracy. These are people, just as we are, and we need to pray for them. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. All of us are just as vulnerable as these people are. I often say, hired a lot of people around the world and paid them a lot of money in some of these institutions that I worked at. And I'll tell you want to be around big money? It changes people, a lot of people. Very few people I know that have been able to survive those hot fires. And I often say, I like to see what somebody would do, like blue pinstripe suit, and $2 million salary. Most of these industries that are behind these kinds of developments put a very, very, very high incentive on those individuals who are bringing about gains, productivity, or whatever you have. Enormous, many, many, many times their base salary. It completely takes over their motivation on things. So I just want to make that point. We're all part of this. We are, in small ways, or can be. And so I don't want to lose perspective of that. Without a doubt, I now want to bring this back to the prophecy timeline here. And I see a number of applications, as already mentioned earlier. This verse, the two visions of Zechariah in chapter 5 are quite important, I believe, but we don't have the time to talk about it. But he says, the iniquity of the people throughout the land, those kinds of commercial conditions that he depicted there in chapter 5 are here today. It's wickedness, and we need to remember that. Ezekiel also chimed into that. So what will play out here in the future? There's going to be a global collapse. There's no question about it. It will happen, in my view, in the second part of the tribulation, but not before. It won't. The world needs to have functioning financial markets to at least get to that point, or at least to that point where the false prophet needs to come up with a solution for the dire conditions that we see at that point. So we can expect financial markets to remain very, very shaky. We're going to see more crises. We need more crises from the policymakers' perspective, as we've already heard at this conference. And they will remain ascending, alluring, and ensnaring all that time. So I think it's easier, becoming a Christian in the tribulation period than staying and being a good Christian right now, living in the environment that we are. Much, much more difficult, I think. Different consequences, but in terms of living in the culture that we're in, I think it's much, much more difficult for us to do so. And of course, part of this is we're going to see some huge geopolitical dislocations just yet. And probably some of these will involve financial crises. That might be even much bigger than the global financial crisis that we saw play out. I don't know which one that's going to be. I can't predict that. The final one we know is in the tribulation period. So, as I've just to keep on the prophecy link here very quickly, a lot of these things I've talked about are things that culminate in fulfillment, if you will, in the tribulation period or thereafter. So many of the things I've been talking about are enablers. I think the other day we called them, sort of pave the way. They're not fulfillment of prophecy per se, but they're enablers that progressively get us to that situation and allow those prophesied events to happen inside the tribulation period. But I do believe that many of the things that we've talked about in these last number of minutes do apply to the church age. So they're not prophecies per se, but they are. James chapter 5, 1 through 5. I already quoted the 1 Timothy chapter 3. Those all more pertain to the challenges that Christians will face and succumb to as hearts grow cold and that kind of thing. So I'm looking at two things here: prophetic fulfillment. Those are some things, but right now, that's what's relevant to us here right now, is some of those prophecies in the New Testament that pertain to our faith and how we succumb to these last day systems. That's relevant right now. We put together years ago, 10 years ago, I wrote a book called The End Time Money Snare, How to Live Free. And at that time, I came up with this indicator called the End Time Money Snare Indicator. So if you look at that white line, it continues to ascend. As long as it's ascending, it traversed very nicely the global financial crash there in 2008, 2009. It's back to ascending. As long as it's ascending, it's meaning this financial trap that I've talked about is getting ever tighter and ever more of something that we need to be aware of. So I'm going to conclude here now. I think, I'm doing pretty good. 45 minutes.
You're doing fine.
Okay. I'll slow down maybe. Why are so many people in the world, so many of people we know, Christians, so oblivious to the encroachments of this end-time money system that we're in now and will continue to proceed? I think there's a lot of reasons. I'll just mention a couple of them, and I'll link them up to Bible verses. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 18. Having the understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them because of the blindness of the hardening of their heart. Matthew 13:22 talks about the cares of this world have consumed them. Given over. It's so easy to be given over to that kind of lifestyle, given over to indulgence and temporal amusement. Every day we're regaled with offers of amusement everywhere we go. We don't have time to get into all the detail. In their narcissism, they only care about fleshly satiation. We learned about that in Luke 8:14. And, there's deliberate misinformation today. Many places in the Bible tells us that the last days will be typified with much deception. Quite a number of those. And we're in that environment today. There's a lot of deception, a lot of corruption, deliberate misinformation. And most importantly, as has been talked about here quite a bit, who has a biblical worldview anymore today?
Not many.
Not many. That's why I like coming here. Fellowship with you all who hold those same kind of views. And so they have no way of even detecting that big trap is being set up. And the biggest thing that I'm always shocked with, and certainly these last number of years when the central banking authorities have come up with these ridiculous strategies, is that people want to believe. They don't want to, go the narrow paths. They want to be deluded. That's where we are today. Don't tell us the truth. Give us lies and delusions. And that's where we are today. And of course, ultimately, we know what the outcome of that is. And that is wrath and anger will follow, as Romans 2, verse 8 tells us. I want to give you some thoughts for hope for ourselves. Did you know that when Jesus Christ was on earth, there was a major global financial crisis? Did you know that? I guess Jesus Christ went to the cross 33 AD, something like that, 33 AD. Well, the 25 years before that, there was a massive, tumultuous financial period for the Roman Empire. Augustus, at the time, had some very free spending policies, and things got out of hand. When Tiberius came in, he tightened down, cut the budget deficits, and so on and so forth. And eventually what precipitated was quite a number of banking organizations around the Mediterranean went bankrupt. And so it was brewing for 25 years, and in 33 AD, same year that Christ went to Calvary, the big boom happened. All the banks went bust. Now, isn't it interesting? You read all the epistles, you read all the Gospels. Does it tell you anything of the financial backdrop of the world at that day? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. This big crisis is raging across the then known world, and the Bible saw fit not to mention it whatsoever. And I think we can take a lesson from that. If Jesus Christ can come to earth and found the church, the worst financial crisis, similarly, I think it doesn't matter for us here now, right now either. Just as Dr. Jeffress mentioned to us today, now is the best time to be a Christian, a good time to be a Christian. And I think these kinds of financial times of confusion that we're going through do not need to be affected whatsoever, certainly not spiritually, by what's going on in these ongoing crises that we're seeing today. So, I've already sort of told the story here, so I won't reread this and tell you what eventually that Tiberius did. Eventually, they did refund those banks, got things back going. But I find it so interesting that the Bible doesn't think it's important when these global crises happen. So, where with Christians? A warning for our benefit, and we also see that mentioned for the Laodicean church, is to hold the world loosely, to leave the cares of the world behind. As the Bible says in Luke 21:34, "Be careful, your hearts will be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and the anxieties of life, and that they would close on you suddenly like a trap." That's why I called that book 10 years ago The End Time Money Snare, or The End Time Money Trap, alluding to this verse right here. And the thought to keep in mind, even though Paul said this almost 2,000 years ago, I think it's still relevant for us, particularly now. And he says, "What I mean, brothers, is that time is short." Just as Jude says also, we only have so much time to pull people out of the fire. Those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep, those who use things of this world as if not engrossed in them, for this world in its present form is passing away. Store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. There is a great exchange offer. Best investment opportunity ever. And that is, Jesus Christ does give us the opportunity to translate filthy earthly money into heavenly treasures. And that's an offer we still have time to take advantage of. So with that, I'd like to close. Thank you.